Welcome back. So in the last video of this lecture, I want to talk a little bit about some of the implications of Piketty's work if we want to accept his conclusions, and then talk very briefly about some of the criticisms that his work has drawn. So as we've talked about, Piketty's essential argument is that this period in the mid-1900s where we had relatively high shares of the total economic output going towards wages, going to labor as opposed to capital, and relatively low levels of economic inequality might have been an anomaly generated by the fact that World War I and World War II destroyed a large share of the world's capital, especially a large share of Europe's capital. Piketty argues that as that capital is being recovered, and as natural forces of capital accumulation lead to greater and greater concentration of capital into a handful of hands, we're heading back towards a society that looks more like the 19th century, where you're going to see a larger share of total economic output go towards the inheritors of very, very large fortunes, as opposed to entrepreneurs or doctors or scientists or other people who are very high earners or very highly productive workers. Now, if this is true, it has some pretty important implications for intergenerational mobility, for inequality, and for economic growth as a whole. The really crucial point here is that in a world dominated by earnings inequality, the key question is, how can you equalize opportunities for children of low-income families and children of higher-income families to develop the human capital necessary, make the connections necessary, and be given the opportunities necessary to take very high-earning jobs? But if capital is a dominant force in society, all of that is not really going to generate high levels of equality. If capital is a dominant force in society, the only way to attain equality of earnings or equality of opportunity is to equalize the distribution of capital or to equalize the fruits of capital. Likewise, and maybe more surprisingly or more interestingly, Piketty makes the argument that a society that's dominated by large amounts of wealth, particularly inherited wealth, is going to develop a different set of ethics around production and a different type of elite than is observed in a society where economic outcomes are primarily driven by earnings. In particular, he argues that when wealth is a dominant force, especially inherited wealth in society, people are going to devote their time and effort and talent towards getting access to that inherited wealth, as opposed to devoting it to productive activities. Essentially, we can think of a wealth-dominated society like existed in Europe in the 1900s as being almost like an oil-rich country, where instead of having people develop new technologies or build skills, you're going to see the most highly placed people in society fighting over access to that resource, to something like oil. So he illustrates this by, in a couple points in his book, highlighting a connection or drawing references to 19th century literature. So for example, he talks about this book called Père Giraud, which talks about social mobility in Paris during this 19th century period of very high inequality, where he essentially makes the argument that in this book, Balzac argues that the best someone can expect to do in terms of their earnings or their economic position in life by becoming a very highly productive worker is nowhere near as well as they can expect to do by marrying someone with money. So he says, the Baron de Rastignac thinks of becoming an advocate, does he? That's a nice prospect for you. 10 years of drudgery straight away. You're obliged to live at the rate of 1,000 francs a month. You must have a library of law books, live in chambers, go into society, go down on your knees to ask a solicitor for briefs, lick the dust off the floor of the Palais de Justice. If this kind of business led to anything, I should say no, but just give me the names of 5 advocates here in Paris who by the time they're 50 are making 50,000 francs a year. Bah! I would sooner turn pirate on the high seas than have my soul shrivel up inside me like that. How will you find the capital? There is but one way, marry a woman who has money. So essentially the argument he's making here is that in a society where it's possible to have an income of 50,000 francs a year, just by marrying someone who owns a large share of assets, people are going to devote their time and attention and energy towards trying to find the right marriages or fighting their siblings for inheritance, instead of devoting their time, attention, and energy to building their human capital or developing new innovative technologies. And to the extent that that's true of the elite, that might be an ethic that dominates society as a whole. So Piketty argues, as a result, that if we think that inequality in earnings might drive high levels of productivity or create incentives to invest in human capital, high inequality in wealth, especially in inherited wealth, might do the opposite. So if we come to from this to say, what policy implications does this bring? Right, if this is not quite the Marxist robot apocalypse, but still an undesirable future that we might be driving towards, what can we do to avoid that future? Piketty essentially argues that the policy prescriptions that are going to work here are fairly limited and are fairly aggressive redistributive policies. Again, if we think that earnings inequality is what's important, then we can have very rich, complex debates about investment in schools, investments in prenatal care, right, anti-discrimination policies, all of these things that are going to change people's incentives to invest in human capital and ability to invest in human capital. But if we're really talking about the dominance of inherited wealth, the only tool that's going to work is redistribution of wealth. So Piketty's big policy advice, which he admits is never going to happen, is to have an international wealth tax. Essentially, tax fortunes above a certain high amount, something like $50 million a year, at a fixed amount, regardless of where in the world the holder of that wealth resides. And this is really the basis, right, of the Bernie Sanders wealth tax proposal or the Elizabeth Warren wealth tax proposal that we saw debated in the most recent Democratic primary. The idea here is very simple. If we think that there's all of these negative consequences of large accumulations of wealth, we should, first of all, try to disincentivize the accumulation of large shares of wealth through taxation, right? We shouldn't worry too much about this having negative economic outcomes by discouraging saving among the rich, because this saving might lead to negative social outcomes that outweigh the benefits of that capital. In addition, it might be really the only tool in our arsenal, right? It might be the only way to avoid these large accumulations of wealth, or the only way to have society broadly benefit from these large accumulations of wealth. He also has a couple of more modest policy proposals, all of which amount to redistribution of wealth. So for instance, he proposes reducing tuition at public and private colleges, or completely eliminating college tuition, as a way of essentially reducing debt levels for middle class and lower middle class families, and therefore reducing inequality in wealth, allowing people to start accumulating wealth earlier in their lives, and paying for that again through taxation on very, very large fortunes, right? Of course, large inheritance taxes, but all of this is going to boil down to redistribution of wealth. Okay, so that's Piketty's big argument. So what are some of the central critiques? As I mentioned, this book got a tremendous amount of attention. It was attacked from a variety of angles. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the data critiques because they're really complicated and really dry. But there's a couple of important theoretical critiques that I want to spend a minute on. So the first one is that when Piketty makes this argument and when he builds his data sets, he doesn't really distinguish between wealth on the one hand and capital on the other hand. What I mean by that is, when we think about wealth, we basically mean any sort of accumulation of assets that a person draws an income from, right? So if I buy, or just any accumulation of assets overall. If I buy a grand piano, right, and that's an asset that has value, that can be factored in as part of my wealth. For that matter, if I buy, a Mustang or a probably even more expensive cars in the world, right, a BMW, a Lamborghini, that's going to be factored into my wealth, even if that's depreciating. Art, anything like this. Likewise, something like a bank account, something like stocks in a company, or something like an IOU, right? I might lend you money. That's going to be wealth for me and debt for you. So wealth is fundamentally financial. On the other hand, capital is a little bit more specific. Capital is an input in production, right? Capital serves a productive purpose in economic activity. So for something to count as capital, it has to be something like machinery or equipment for businesses or stocks in a company or something else that is fundamentally generative in nature, as opposed to something that's lent from one person to another, which is financial wealth, or something like a consumer durable, something like art or something like a fancy car, which is worth money to me, but is not part of the productive economy. Now, the reason that that's going to matter is a lot of Piketty's critics are going to say that these big differences he's showing over time in the accumulation of wealth or the share of total income that is going towards the holders of wealth is really capturing not the return to capital, right? This thing we would care about if we wanted to understand the fundamental production function driving the economy, but the return to these other sources of wealth. And in particular, that this rising importance of wealth over time we've seen recently might be driven more by the value of urban real estate in places like New York or LA or Tokyo or London than it is by anything happening with productive capital. And as a result, right, we might not think that New York real estate getting really expensive is a fundamental law of capitalism. We might think that New York real estate or LA real estate getting expensive is rather just a function of the age distribution of the country right now, the popularity of these particular cities, building codes in these particular cities, things that can be addressed with much more specific policies. The other big critique, which connects to this, is that Piketty's model, when he talks about R being greater than G, leading to this opportunity for infinite accumulation of wealth or ever greater accumulation of wealth, isn't a sufficiently disciplined model of the economy. It doesn't model it doesn't model individual behavior well enough, and it also doesn't model the productive process in the economy well enough. So from an individual behavior perspective, R greater than G is going to be sufficient to show that it's possible for someone who has a large amount of wealth to have their wealth accumulate faster than economic output over time. But it doesn't necessarily tell you that someone will choose to do that, right? What we would need in order to say that large fortunes are going to accumulate over time faster than the economy is going to grow is that a person who has a large fortune is going to have an incentive to let most of that fortune accumulate. Now, clearly this is something that happened at least some of the time during this kind of aristocratic era in the 19th century and before, but that might be a product of very specific social factors of the time. In particular, an aristocratic ethic or a set of social norms among people in the elite that really prioritized preserving a family name, preserving a family legacy, preserving a family's social status. If we don't have those sorts of norms in place anymore, if anything, we might have the opposite norms, right? The people might be embarrassed about inherited wealth. We might expect people with large fortunes to spend their money, even if they would have the option, because R is greater than G, of allowing their fortunes to accumulate across generations. Likewise, Piketty's argument really relies, the idea that this large accumulation of wealth is going to lead to more and more of economic output going towards the holders of wealth, really depends on capital and labor being gross substitutes, right? We talked about if we have a Cobb-Douglas production function, in other words, capital and labor are neither substitutes nor complements, it won't matter how much capital is accumulated, we'll always have the same share of the economy going to labor. In order to have this sort of gradual replacement of workers by capital, we need capital and labor to be gross substitutes. Piketty's argument for this being the case is essentially these graphs that I showed you. It's essentially that the share of economic output that he can attribute to capital with his data is higher during periods with lots of capital accumulation than periods with less capital accumulation. On the other hand, other researchers who have looked at data from firms or looked at more micro-level data with a more parsimonious definition of capital, right? Definitions of capital that are really focused on productive inputs rather than wealth, have tended to find the opposite. They've tended to find either that the interaction between capital and labor looks pretty similar to Cobb-Douglas, right? So that you can increase capital. If you increase capital by 10%, you'll decrease rental rates by 10%, not change the share of the economy going to capital. Or that capital and labor are gross complements. In other words, if you increase capital by 10%, you decrease the interest rate by more than 10% and actually reduce the share of the economy going to capital. If it's the case that capital and labor are gross complements, then what we would expect is, if we're going back to this 7-to-1 ratio of capital to economic output, right, we're seeing greater and greater and greater accumulations of capital. If anything, that's going to result in capital getting a smaller and smaller and smaller share of economic output. More broadly, people who have done more careful research on trying to understand where the labor shares and capital shares come from in the economy might tell you that we shouldn't expect this to be, the relationship between capital and labor, whether they're substitutes or complements, might not be a stable, consistent, fundamental characteristic of capitalist economies. That it might be a product of very specific technological moments, and the technological moment today might look very different from the technological moment in the 19th century. And as I mentioned before, right, these arguments against Piketty are going to be more strongly in favor of interpreting this current rise in inequality and this current reduction in labor share as being the result of new technologies that are being adopted now that make a handful of workers ultra productive in the short run. If this is the case, we might expect a Kuznets curve type behavior, that as these technologies diffuse more broadly, we're going to end up seeing declines in income inequality later. Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about today. Thank you so much for bearing with me through all of this. Again, it has been such a pleasure to work with you guys and learn from you guys throughout this semester. I hope you are having a wonderful time whenever it is you're watching this, and I can't wait to talk to you on Thursday.